Start by briefly overviewing, because we got to overview, else we have no clue what we're talking about. This is a mimer of Basi Ligani. It's focusing on the krushim, the planks of wood in the Mishkan and what they symbolize. The krushim were made from atzi shitim, from acacia wood, shitim, from the root word shtus, folly, because through the work of the Mishkan, through the work of serving Hashem, we take the foolishness of this world, the folly of the world, and we transform it to a folly of Kedusha. As people might think, oh, you're so foolish living your lives and prioritizing spirituality and doing all this stuff instead of focusing on what's real and important. So we should have a shtus of Kedusha, a folly of godliness, to know what's real and what's important. And the krushim, these planks of wood, the word keresh, we said also, if I jumble the letters, it's sheker, it's falseness, and it's kesher, it's a bond. Because we're starting off with a sheker, with the falseness of this world. And through the keresh, through the work of the Mishkan, we take the sheker and we make it a kesher. We take the falseness and we make it a bond. We fuse the world to Hashem through our avodah. And then we connected this keresh, these planks of wood, to the amudim, the pillars. And we explained that the Rebbe Rayat says that these krushim, these amudim, the keresh is similar to the mitzvahs, and the mitzvahs are mamshich and mechaber. They draw down and fuse the highest godliness, really the light of atzmos, of essence of God itself, to the worlds. And similarly, the krushim, planks of the tabernacle of the Mishkan, are mechaber. They fuse this highest energy of Hashem, of God, to the worlds. And the Rebbe says, there's a discrepancy here. The Rebbe Rayat said the krushim are similar to the mitzvahs. Not exactly the mitzvahs, so similar to. And we see in the description, the Rebbe Rayat changes from how he describes the krushim to how he describes the mitzvahs. Because the mitzvahs draw down and fuse the infinity of God to the worlds, but the krushim only fuse the infinity of God to the world. It does not draw down. And that's supposedly what we're going to talk about today. The Rebbe also brought out another discrepancy when we look at how the Alter Rebbe is talking about these pillars, that the krushim, as we explained based on a verse, are like these pillars, these amudim. They're omdim, standing, which is like the word amudim, pillars, which is like the mitzvahs, because the Alter Rebbe compares the mitzvahs to these pillars. But again, there's a discrepancy. When we're talking about the mitzvahs, he speaks of how they're implanted in the highest spiritual heights. And when he speaks about the pillars, the physical metaphor for them, he speaks about how they're cemented in the earth. And we're like, wait, if the mitzvahs are cemented in the highest heavens, the pillars represent them, they should be cemented in the ceiling. Why are they cemented in the floor? And that question we initially answered. That was the first thing we focused on in Eis Gimel. And we said, well, there's a difference. Because in physicality, our physical world is unlike anything else in creation. Because all of creation comes from godliness. It's a level of godliness, coming from a higher level of godliness, becoming a lower level of godliness, which in turn constricts and creates another, even lower level of godliness, which in turn constricts and creates another, even lower level of godliness. And that's what all of creation is. Godliness forming more godliness that's even lower than its source, which then forms more godliness that's lower than its source. And when we get to the lowest godliness, supposedly we morph into physicality. But guess what? Godliness can't create physicality. So it actually happens at that point. It's Hashem in his essence and being creates physicality. So godliness to lower godliness, to lower godliness, to lower godliness, to lower godliness, to Hashem himself in his essence and being creating the physicality of our world. And therefore, if we understand that, we understand that the more physical something is, the more it's really an expression of the essence and being of God himself. So that's why when we're talking about the pillars, which are physical, the lower they are, the more powerful they are. So that's why the pillars are cemented in the floor. But the mitzvahs aren't physical, they're spiritual. It's a spiritual will and wisdom of God. So therefore, its strength is not low. It's in spirituality, the lower you get, the weaker and weaker and weaker the spirituality gets, right? One level of godliness minimizes and creates a lower level, which minimizes and creates a lower level. So I speak of the mitzvahs, the commandments, the lower they are, so to speak, the weaker the spirituality is. So the strength of the mitzvah is in the ceiling, in our highest spiritual height. The strength of the pillars is in its physicality, in its lowest low. So this was a very strong piece where the Rebbe was really focusing on how amazingly precious physical is. And we gave 3 parables from the Mitzvah Rebbe. Remember I said in this mimer, the Rebbe is going to quote every Rebbe by name and by Torah teaching. So we brought in the Alter Rebbe, We brought in the Mittler Rebbe with 3 parables showing the lower something is, the more it has the most intense power, which we're saying is why physicality is like, whoa, it's so physical. It's so God himself. And we're going to bring in today, perhaps, we'll see how far we get, the Baal Shem Tov, quoted by name in Torah, and the Maggid of Messer. So the Rebbe said at the end of the previous ice, based on the idea of the pillars, that if it's really cemented firmly, it has to be in hard earth, not in like the loose, crumbly stuff. You want it to be really firm, it's got to be a really hard earth, which again, these pillars are representative of the commandments, of the mitzvahs. So the Rebbe said the same way, the mitzvahs, it's got to be cemented in real physicality. And the more physical, the better. And that was a very brief overview to bring us quickly up to where we are holding, which is Ois Hey, the 5th section of this mimer. So in Ois Hey, we are up to now answering that other question we raised in Ois Beis. Remember, in Ois Beis, we raised basically 2 issues. One, why the discrepancy that the pillars are cemented in the bottom and the mitzvahs are cemented in the top, which we dealt with. And the question that we actually raised also very significantly, why do we see in the language of Basi Ligani, of the Rebbe Rayatz, that the krushim, the planks of the Mishkan, are only similar to the mitzvahs, but not actually like the mitzvahs? And therefore, when the Rebbe Rayatz is talking about the krushim, and when he's talking about the mitzvahs draw down and fuse the highest of God, essence of God, atzmos, with world. But the krushim, the planks of wood, fuse essence of God with world, but don't draw it down. They only fuse. So what's the difference? Why is the Rebbe Rayatz, in a very, very subtle way, you got to be the Rebbe to see this, highlighting seemingly a really big difference? So the Rebbe said, based on everything we already know that we learned in the first 4 ices of this mimer, it's very obvious. Because the krushim are talking about a spiritual service of God. The mitzvahs can be and are primarily a physical service of God. Now, obviously, we're physical people with physical bodies, with physical heads, with physical brains, with physical hearts. So everything we do on some level connects to physicality. But within physicality, the krushim represent the spiritual service. Why is that? Because the krushim are the planks of the tabernacle. Well, what happened in the tabernacle? Well, in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, we offered korbanos. Now, of course, in the tabernacle, this was very physical because we physically took animals and birds and flour and oil and wine and water and offered it to God. But how we today do the service of the tabernacle and do the service of the korbanos, of the offerings, how we today, symbolic of the keresh of these planks, transform the shtus, the folly of this world that's sub-rational, to the super-rational folly of dedicating ourselves to God. How we take the sheker of this world, remember the jumbled letters of keresh, and we transform that to kesher, another jumbling of those letters, binding it to God. We're doing that spiritually. Meaning, in the temple and in the tabernacle, there was a physical altar with physical fire. There was actually 2 fires. The fires from above that came down in the form of a lion consuming the offerings, and the fire from below that was offered by the priests. And there was physical animals and birds. And this was all physical, but representative of a spiritual service. If a Jew sinned and offers an animal to God, why does that help? What does that have to do with anything? Because as he's standing there watching that animal burn, he's supposed to be thinking, that should be me, but for the grace of God. And he's changing inside. So too, when we are doing the service of the tabernacle, of the krushim, of these planks of wood, the offering is offering ourselves, right? Like the Alter Rebbe's famous teaching, Adam ki Yaakov mikan kardam laHashem, that the man is ultimately offering himself up as the offering to God. We're the offering. Well, what part of myself am I offering? I'm offering the impurities of my animal soul. There's the fire of my animal soul. There's the fire of my godly soul, the fire from above, the godly, the fire from below, the animal. And through my service, my personal tabernacle, my personal altar, the fire of the godly soul is consuming and burning out the impurities of the fires of the animal soul. And I'm offering my godly soul and my animal soul to God. That's beautiful. That's powerful. That's taking sheker and making it a kesher, taking the falseness, making it a bond. That's taking the shtus of this world and making it a shtus of godliness. And it's all spiritual. And therefore, the Rebbe says, it's limited. Because what we're bringing out in this mimer is the enormous power of the physical. Because in the physical, as we said in the 3rd ois, in yesh hanivras yesh ha'amiti. in the physical yesh and substance of this world is the only true substance there really is, God. Because only God can create physical. So even though it's a very high holy service to take the fires of your godly soul and consume and transform the fires of your animal soul, and it's amazing, we should all merit to do it, and to offer on the altar of God your animal soul is amazing, but it's a spiritual service. And by definition, therefore, it's limited. And that's why the Rebbe Rayatz does not write that the planks of wood, that they're drawing down the godliness of Atzmos, of essence of God himself. They're drawing down godliness, but they're drawing down godliness that's chesed of God, his kindness, but not his Atzmos, not his essence and being. For essence and being, it has to be a physical mitzvah. And we see a very interesting reference or brings to support this from the Baal Shem Tov. That the Baal Shem Tov says that these krushim, these planks of wood, symbolize man's service. Well, that's actually what we've been saying this whole time. He says, how does it symbolize man's service? Because the plank of wood was 10 amos tall. And that's the measurement of the body of man. And we're like, really? 10 amos is 15 feet. Not too many people are 15 feet tall. It says Moshe Rabbeinu was 15 feet tall, but not the rest of us. You know, what's a tall man today? A 7-foot man? Oh my gosh, you know? Must be a star basketball player somewhere. It was a 7-foot man. And we're talking about 15 feet. So what does it mean? What does the Baal Shem Tov mean to say, yes, the keresh, this is representing man because the body of man is 10 amos, just like the keresh. So, well, the point is, the body of man, as it says in Tikkunei Zohar, is made up of 3 and 7. The 3 intellectual attributes and the 7 emotional attributes. And 3 plus 7 is 10. So the body of man, if I'm thinking of it as a spiritual body of man, yes, that's 10. 3 Chabad, 7 the Midos, 3 plus 7 is 10. But that's only the spiritual body. That's not the physical body. So when the Baal Shem Tov is saying that the keresh is symbolic of man because the man's body, like the keresh, is 10 amos, and we're like 10, yeah, 3 intellectual and 7 emotional, that right away is telling us that the keresh is symbolizing the spiritual body of man, not the physical body, because the physical body is not 15 feet tall. So this is a support for what the Rebbe is saying here, that the keresh symbolizes spiritual avodah, the spiritual service of God, and that's its limitation. Again, we would think, oh, spiritual service, that's so beautiful and lofty and high. It's beautiful, it's lofty, and it's high, but it's also a limitation, because God himself is in the physical. And that's why the mitzvah is a mamshich. The mitzvah draws down Atzmos itself. Why does the mitzvah draw down Atzmos itself? Because the mitzvahs are with physicality. And actually, anything we do, even spiritual things we do, honestly, involve the physicality of our body. That's actually how we do them. So every mitzvah has to have a physical component. And you could say, okay, well, a lot of mitzvahs are actions, and that's easy, or deal with physical things like wool and linen and clothing and food. But then there's spiritual mitzvahs, like loving God and fearing God, like learning about God, learning Torah. The Rebbe says it all goes back to physicality. Because to fulfill the mitzvah of loving and fearing God, it has to affect your physical body. If it doesn't affect your physical body, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah. Meaning, if someone is scared, their flesh constricts. That's why it says, like Chassidus gives this famous example, like in a fire, go back to fire again, you could get into a very small place, and then after the fire, you can't get out of it. Because the fear of the fire literally constricted your flesh. So the Rebbe says, to fear God, it has to literally constrict your flesh. Then we know you feared God. And the same thing conversely with love. That love is expansive. And there should be an expanding of the body with love. Pleasure, delight is expansive. It says, Shmua toiva tidoshin otzem. Good news makes fat the bones. Right? Was it Vespasian that when he heard that he was Caesar, he couldn't take his foot out of his shoe, couldn't put on it, like his bones grew from his pleasure. Right? It says of Nachum of Chernobyl that he was physically fat from the pleasure he had in saying, Amen, Yehei, Shmei, Rabbah. So the Rebbe says, you love Hashem, you fulfill the mitzvah, change your body. You fear Hashem, you fulfill the mitzvah, change your body. You have pleasure in Hashem, it changed your body. You developed a fat from the pleasure of your delight in Hashem. And the Rebbe says, when you learn about Hashem, it's changing your mind. It's very interesting. The Rebbe writes this. There's threads or wrinkles in the mind, which of course is what science knows now, that as we study and as we learn and as actually we think, there's new synapses that are forming in our mind, new connections, new threads. The mind is growing and growing and growing, of course, in a very small way. But if you would measure the circumference of the head, and it should be that there's a bigger head there as you learn more and more and more and more and more. That literally your mind is expanding physically as you think more, study more, and have more knowledge. So the Rebbe says, when you're learning Torah and grasping God, your physical brain is changing, which we actually know today it is. And when you love and when you fear, when you have pleasure in God, your physical body is changing. So that shows you that even seemingly our most spiritual service, like loving and fearing and having pleasure in God, like studying and comprehending God, it all has to go back to the physical. Why does it all have to go back to the physical? Because that's where it's at. That's where God's at. So again, as we said, it's not that in a spiritual service you're not affecting God's energy. You are. But the Rebbe said you're affecting chesed, which is chesed atzilus, a very high level of godliness. But when you do the mitzvah, the physical mitzvah, you're drawing down all the way from atzmos, from the essence and being of God himself, because the essence and being of God is invested in the mitzvah. So that's why the mitzvah, exclusively, specially, more than the keresh, is mamshich. Not only is mechaber, is fusing Hashem with the world, but it's drawing more atmos into the world. And then the Rebbe brings support from the Maggid. And the Maggid is based on a pasuk, Ushmartem es chukosai, ves mishpatai, asher ya'aseh osam ha'adam, v'chai bahem. So the pasuk is saying, guard my chukim and my mishpatim, that man should do and live with them. And the Maggid says, Kosai, that relates to your using your thought to serve God. Mishpatai, that relates to your speech. And he brings proof texts for all this. Asher yasa adam, that man does, that relates to your action. And only then, when we reach the level of action, v'chai bahem, then there's life in them. Then we draw life into the commandments. Again, we want to use our thoughts to serve God. We want to connect with our speech to God. We want everything. But what's going to draw down v'chai bahem, the chayas, the life in the mitzvahs? It's when the man does them. When we have the level of physical action, then v'chai bahem. Then we're drawing life down into the mitzvahs. So what we're seeing from here is, in this entire ois, that as we utilize the physicality of this world and connect the physicality to God, we bring him himself into this world. Atzmos. We can be spiritual and we can draw down spiritual levels of God, and that's great and wonderful and terrific and amazing. And we can do physical things, and with the physical mitzvahs, bring Hashem's essence and being here, which is what he wants, which is Mashiach. So this is really emphasizing the enormous superiority of action.